You guys all know about the political spectrum. On the left over here, you got your communists. On the right over here, you got your fascists. And in the middle, that's where most of the mainstream parties want to be. That's the sweet spot. Except it's actually a lot more complicated than that.
Conservative members across this country have been patient.
I believe that Canadians across this country are so frustrated because they're working so hard and they're following all the rules.
He didn't put it there, but he struggled to get rid of it. And that was the issue.
Usually when we talk about politics, we talk about that left to right, or progressive to conservative, spectrum. The idea is that any political policy can be plotted somewhere along that line. Legalization of cannabis? That's a leftist thing. Getting tough on drugs? That's a right-wing thing. And since politicians and political parties are just an amalgam of their policies, we can plot them on the political spectrum as well. If your party's tough on crime and low on taxes, it's on the right. If it's tax and spend and wants to do something about systemic racism, it's more on the left. But this doesn't leave that much room for nuance, because at some point in your life, you're going to meet someone who has a left-wing policy on one issue, but a right-wing policy on another. Are they left-wing or right-wing? You don't know. So oftentimes when talking politics, we split the one spectrum into two. One for fiscal policy, and one for social policy. Fiscal policy is all about how much government spends and where it gets that money from. Should government spend money on its people, or should it leave the money in people's pockets so that they can spend it themselves? Social policy is the spectrum where we have questions about things like immigration, marriage equality, whether or not you should have access to safe and legal abortion, what we should teach kids in school, what we should do about systemic racism. Does systemic racism even exist? It does. If you're hearing people talk about those issues, they're talking about social policies. And now that we have these two spectrums, instead of saying that someone is progressive or conservative, we can say that they are fiscally progressive or fiscally conservative, or socially progressive or socially conservative. When we say those phrases, we're using something of a shorthand. When we say fiscally conservative, we mean people who want government to spend less so that it can tax people less. A more money in your pocket kind of vibe. When we say socially progressive, we usually mean someone who, for example, supports the right of same-sex couples to marry and the right of people to get a safe and legal abortion. I mean, like a real kind of progressive vibe. Obviously, this is still a massive oversimplification. There are, for example, people who support gun restriction but don't support abortion rights. But still, having two spectrums instead of one is a lot more useful, and it lets us explain one of the biggest divides in the Conservative Party today. Today, members of the Conservative Party of Canada are choosing who they want to lead the party for the next however long that's going to end up being. This is the person that's going to go toe-to-toe with the Prime Minister on issues of spending and policy, and this is also the person who quite possibly might end up being the next Prime Minister of Canada. Now, we've got about half an hour until the convention really kicks into gear, so I'd like to just quickly talk about how we got here. You might not know this, but the Conservative Party is really big on lower taxes. Shocker, I know. Lower taxes and less government spending is considered to be fiscally conservative, and it's something that pretty much everybody in the Conservative Party of Canada agrees on. This is where slogans like,
"It's time for you to get ahead,"
come from. You know, government should stop holding you down and should let you use your own money to help yourself get ahead. And hey, it's a persuasive take, and it does persuade a lot of Canadians in a lot of elections. And for that reason, a lot of Conservatives think that it is the only take they should ever run on. The Conservatives always talk about how the Liberals and the NDP are the parties of tax and spend, how the Conservatives are the party of more money in your pocket. They'll complain about how the CERB incentivizes people to stay home and not work, and Conservatives are usually the first in line to implement cost-cutting measures. But cost-cutting and tax-cutting is not all that the Conservative Party is about, because there are still people in the Conservative Party, be they MPs or members or even just supporters, who think that government should restrict people's access to abortion, or that it should ban gay marriage. And they think that the Conservative Party should be running on those policies as well. The thing is, while those social conservatives are a pretty big part of the Conservative Party of Canada's base, they're not a big part of the Canadian electorate at large. It is pretty easy to convince a majority of Canadians that cutting taxes would be a good idea, but 3/4 of Canadians think that same-sex marriage is okay, and about 3/4 again think that safe and legal access to abortion is a good thing. And so for the longest time inside the Conservative Party, the struggle has been between those who believe that running on fiscal policies is the only way to win elections, and those who want to campaign on socially conservative issues as well. For a lot of social conservatives, this has been a major point of division. Many of them feel excluded from their party, but they have nowhere else to take their votes. Because like the Liberals, the NDP, the Bloc Québécois, and the Green Party are all pro-choice, and they all support a ban on conversion therapy. They're all pretty much generally pro-LGBTQ. So what you gonna do? The whole reason that the Tories had this leadership race is down to that socially conservative divide. During the 2019 election, Andrew Scheer ran a pretty much fiscally conservative campaign.
I have a plan to lower the cost of living, to make life more affordable, to leave more money in the pockets of Canadians.
But he found himself constantly dogged by questions about his personal socially conservative views. Scheer himself is anti-abortion, and he has, in the past, voiced some pretty offensive views about same-sex marriage.
How many legs would a dog have if you counted the tail as a leg? The answer is just 4. Just because you call a tail a leg doesn't make it a leg.
But in fairness, he said that he wouldn't reopen these debates if he were elected Prime Minister. Andrew Scheer had run a campaign about lower taxes and getting oil to market, but in the end, that wasn't enough. When asked about why the Conservative Party lost that election, Peter MacKay, the former leader of the Progressive Conservatives and a former cabinet minister under Stephen Harper, said that Andrew Scheer's socially conservative views had
hung around Andrew Scheer's neck like a stinking albatross, quite frankly.
That remark really came back to haunt Peter MacKay, didn't it? And so with the Conservatives' 2019 election loss, blame soon turned to Andrew Scheer, and he got booted as party leader. The leadership race was begun, and 4 candidates put their names into the hat. Peter MacKay, Erin O'Toole, Leslyn Lewis, and Derek Sloan. Leslyn Lewis and Derek Sloan are social conservatives. Leslyn Lewis has said that she's against a ban on conversion therapy, and Derek Sloan questioned the national loyalty of Canada's top doctor, Theresa Tam. Sloan also called for Canada to end its support of the World Health Organization, and Lewis drew the support of a lot of anti-abortion figures and groups. Oh, and they're both against protections for trans rights. On the other end of the social versus fiscal debate was Peter MacKay. His view was that to win the next election, Conservatives would have to provide a strong take based on fiscally conservative policies and only fiscally conservative policies. But for many social conservatives, MacKay's stinking albatross comment hung around MacKay's neck like a stinking albatross. Many felt personally disrespected by the remark, and so his support amongst social conservatives dwindled. And finally, there was Erin O'Toole. Erin O'Toole's whole platform was pretty much identical to Peter MacKay's, but the way he ran his campaign, his messaging, that was all social conservative. O'Toole's slogan was,
Let's take back Canada.
He branded himself as a blue Tory and dubbed Peter MacKay Liberal Light.
Who's going to defend our history, our institutions against attacks from cancel culture and the radical left?
All of this was intended to appeal to social conservatives.
We need strong leadership to unite our party, take the hyphen out of being a conservative, and ensure we grow our movement to win.
That, in the end, is what did it for O'Toole. Okay, so it's 9 o'clock now, Pacific, after midnight Eastern time, and there still isn't a result, although it should be out within the next few minutes, hopefully. Apparently, it's going to be pretty close, though, so I guess we'll see what comes out. The Conservative Party has a pretty interesting balloting system. Instead of just voting for their first choice, Conservative Party members rank their choices for leader. Then each round, the candidate with the least points is eliminated, and all the people who voted for them have their second choice or third choice come into play. If at any point a candidate gets over 50% of the vote, then they've won. So if Peter MacKay had gotten enough votes on that first round, he would have won. But he didn't. He got barely over a third. And so Derek Sloan, who got the least votes that round, was eliminated. The thing is, Derek Sloan's supporters were social conservatives. They weren't going to support Peter MacKay, not after that stinking albatross comment. No, most of their support went then to Leslyn Lewis or Erin O'Toole. Another round came, and still this new support wasn't enough to keep Lewis in the game, so she too was eliminated. And again, Lewis's supporters were mostly socially conservative. But again, they weren't going to vote for Peter MacKay as their next option, so all of those votes went over to Erin O'Toole. And now we are on the final round. Everybody kind of knew what was going to happen. You could see it in the faces of Peter MacKay's campaign team. And yeah, Peter MacKay lost. Erin O'Toole won. In the end, it didn't really matter that Erin O'Toole had run on a fiscally conservative platform. The fact that he differentiated himself enough from Peter MacKay with that little bit of branding was enough to make sure that he got the Social Conservatives' second and third choice votes. So, what does this mean for the country? That's a big one. After the results of the vote had been announced, Erin O'Toole gave an acceptance speech. And in that acceptance speech, he did probably one of the fastest pivots in Canadian political history.
Because I believe that whether you are black, white, brown, or from any race or creed, whether you are LGBT or straight, whether you are an Indigenous Canadian or have joined the Canadian family 3 weeks ago or 3 generations ago.
That entire campaign, he'd run on that socially conservative message.
Whether you worship on Fridays, Saturdays, Sundays, or not at all.
But all of a sudden, he was talking about how his Conservative Party of Canada would be a big blue tent.
You are an important part of Canada.
He was suggesting, in a way, that the Conservative Party was now going to run on a solely fiscally conservative ticket.
And you have a home in the Conservative Party of Canada.
If people believe that a social conservative might get elected in the next election, they're more likely to vote for the lesser of two evils, usually the Liberal Party, as a way of preventing that. A next election might not be that far away. Elections Canada is preparing for one as early as this fall. They're probably going to hold it across 2 voting days instead of just 1, and the results won't be announced immediately due to the pandemic. But it's a very real possibility right now. On the other hand, to avoid an election, the Liberal Party has to have the support of just one political party. And right now it looks like the NDP isn't looking for another election. Is Erin O'Toole a social conservative? I don't think so. He said a lot in the past that he is very pro-choice, although he accepts people into the party who aren't. But on the other hand, his language of Take Back Canada is genuinely kind of frightening. Over the last few years, we've heard a lot more divisive language in Canadian politics than we used to. People calling Trudeau a traitor, people scrawling misogynist graffiti on Catherine McKenna's office. There have been a lot more threats on Canadian politicians' lives of late, and a lot of that anger comes from the language that politicians use to attack each other. Take Back Canada had a whiff of Brexit and of Trumpism about it, and that's a whiff that it's going to take Erin O'Toole a lot to get rid of. See you next time.